Have you ever paused in the middle of the night, lying in your bed, and wondered what life truly looked like for a medieval knight, once the trumpet of war fell silent? You have seen them in films, shining in armor, fearless on horseback and carrying banners into blazing battles. But did you ever ask yourself, what happened after the clash of swords ended, when the shields were lowered, and the thick wooden doors of their stone chambers were shut against the cold night? Behind those doors, where no battlefield songs could reach, knights were not only warriors, they were dreamers, schemers, lovers, sinners, believers, and sometimes even fools, with stories so human that you might recognize a piece of yourself in them. Before we pass into that secret corridor of history, let me ask you a favor. If you find yourself already curious, if your imagination has begun to wander through the flickering corridors of a medieval castle, take just a second, give this video a like, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and subscribe, so you will always be among the first to enter the hidden chambers of forgotten times. Only do this if you are truly ready, because once you follow me through that heavy door, you may never see the idea of night in the same way again. Close your eyes for a moment and let me paint the picture. The castle looms above a dark forest, its towers outlined by the pale light of the moon. A torch flickers on the wall, and from the great hall echoes the faint laughter of men who just hours ago rode with death in their eyes. A knight walks down a narrow corridor, his armor still clanking with every step. His visor is down, his gauntlets are smeared with the dirt of battle, and his boots leave a faint trace of mud on the stone floor. He turns a corner, opens a door bound with iron, and finally steps into the privacy of his chamber. Now imagine that you are there, standing in the shadows, watching silently. What do you see when the helmet comes off? You might expect only a tired face, a man relieved to rest, but what if instead you found secrets whispered in candlelight, rituals carved from superstition, or emotions so raw that they shake the very foundation of what you thought a knight was? Behind closed doors, they were not the flawless champions of chivalry that ballads describe. They could be vulnerable, nervous, playful, even ridiculous. Picture one knight carefully hiding a love letter beneath a mattress, another nervously checking the edge of his sword, even though no one will attack him tonight, and yet another falling asleep while still wearing half his armor simply because he drank too much at the evening feast. The truth is, knights were human, deeply, dangerously, wonderfully human. And that is what makes their secret lives so fascinating. When we hear the word knight, we think of discipline, loyalty, and courage. Yet behind closed doors, courage sometimes slipped into fear, loyalty tangled with temptation, and discipline melted away into moments of laughter, doubt, or silent tears. Imagine being in their place. The world expects you to be a paragon of strength, but your body aches, your heart is restless, and you long for a freedom that no code of chivalry can offer. Now let me ask you, if you were that knight, what would you do once the doors were shut? Would you remove the armor and breathe deeply in relief? Would you confess your sins in whispered prayers, or would you secretly hope for a visit from someone who should not be there at all? These are the questions we will explore tonight, not with judgment but with curiosity and a little bit of humor, because sometimes, even the bravest knight was just a man trying not to trip over his own boots in the dark. So let us step carefully now. The chamber is lit by only a few candles. Shadows stretch across the walls, forming shapes that might look like demons if you stare too long. A jug of wine sits on the table, next to a half-eaten loaf of bread. The helmet rests on the chair, and the knight runs his hand through sweat-dampened hair, sighing, as though the weight of the world has finally been lifted for just a moment. This is where our journey begins. This is where the legends fall silent and the real stories emerge. Stories of whispered fears, hidden joys, forbidden loves, and private rituals. Stay with me, because what lies ahead will not only entertain you but also reveal something about the human condition itself. Knights were warriors. Yes, but they were also men like us, haunted by doubts, tempted by desire, strengthened by friendship, and weakened by secrets they carried alone. Tonight, you and I will walk side by side into their private world. The question is, are you brave enough to open the door? Imagine the sound, a slow scrape of metal against stone, the clatter of a buckle unfastened, the hiss of breath escaping from beneath steel. The helmet, that shining crown of the battlefield, is the first thing to fall away. Behind it is no longer a faceless warrior but a human being. Sweaty, exhausted, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes blinking at the sudden softness of candlelight. For you, standing in the shadows of this chamber, it feels almost like a forbidden moment. You are watching the transformation from legend to man. And what a transformation it is. Out on the field, a knight was the very picture of discipline. His back straight, his voice commanding, his sword raised high in defiance of death. But here, behind closed doors, he might mutter curses under his breath as he fumbles with a stubborn strap. Sometimes it took more effort to peel off the armor than it did to fight an enemy. Imagine a knight grunting and twisting, calling for his squire to help loosen the chainmail, until finally both collapse in laughter on the floor. The battlefield could be grim, but the chamber after battle was often full of these absurdly human struggles. Removing the helmet was symbolic too. Out there, the helmet was a mask of anonymity and power. Inside, when it came off, vulnerability returned. A knight's face revealed cuts, bruises, maybe even a missing tooth. Not exactly the picture you see in a polished painting, and yet there was dignity in those imperfections. They told the story of survival, of battles endured, of a man who lived despite the odds. Sometimes the knight would catch his reflection in a polished shield or a small mirror of polished bronze. Would he see himself as a hero? Or would he see only a tired man, wondering how much longer he could carry the weight of his duty? Think about this. When you come home from a long day of work, maybe you loosen your tie, kick off your shoes, or collapse on the couch. That small ritual of removing your armor is not so different. For knights, it was literally armor, heavy and suffocating. Imagine the relief as the weight finally fell from their shoulders. But along with that relief came a flood of feelings. In the silence of his chamber, a knight might suddenly feel the ache of every muscle, the sting of every cut. He might even whisper a prayer of thanks that he was still alive, or a curse against fate for the scar he now bore. And then there were the more private moments, the ones history tends to ignore. What if a knight, after removing his helmet, looked around nervously to be sure no one was watching? Perhaps he reached under the bed and pulled out a small wooden box filled with trinkets, a lock of hair from a secret lover, a faded ribbon, or even a crude drawing made by a child he had not seen in years. Behind closed doors, the helmet off, the knight was free to remember that he was also a son, a father, or a man in love. Not every revelation was sentimental, of course. Some knights had a sense of humor that only emerged in private. There are records of warriors playing pranks on each other, hiding helmets in chamber pots or filling them with cold water so that the next morning's routine came with a shock. Imagine the scene, a noble knight, sworn to honor and valor, shrieking like a child when icy water splashed down his face. Behind the glamour of tournaments and jousts, there was plenty of laughter, though often at someone else's expense. But sometimes, when the helmet came off, the silence grew heavy. Alone in his chamber, a knight might stare into the darkness and feel a fear deeper than anything on the battlefield. Out there, fear was clear. You fought or you died. In here, fear was more insidious. Fear of failure, of dishonor, of not living up to the impossible ideals of knighthood. What happens when the world demands perfection, but you know in your heart you are imperfect? Perhaps he whispered to himself. How long can I keep this mask on? So tonight, as you stand in the corner of this room with me, watching him undo strap after strap, think of the helmet not just as a piece of armor, but as a symbol. Every time it was lifted away, the knight stepped closer to his true self, and every time he put it back on, he became the legend once more. The question is, which side was more real? The knight the world adored, or the weary man who sighed in relief when the helmet finally came off? Now that the helmet rests quietly on the chair, let us wander deeper into the chamber itself. Have you ever asked yourself what kinds of spaces knights truly inhabited when the world outside grew silent? The battlefield was open, chaotic, and bloody. The chamber, by contrast, was enclosed, private, and full of whispers. A knight's room inside a medieval castle was never just a place to sleep. It was a stage where rituals unfolded, where secrets were stored, and where the most private desires took shape beneath the cloak of darkness. Picture the scene: rough stone walls damp with centuries of cold air. A narrow slit of a window lets in only a pale stream of moonlight. The ceiling is low, beams blackened by smoke from countless candles and torches. In one corner, a bed with straw stuffed into a coarse mattress. Covered by furs that smell faintly of horses, In another corner, a small chest locked tightly, perhaps holding coins, perhaps something more dangerous. Letters, relics, or even evidence of betrayal. These chambers were not luxurious, at least not by modern standards, but they held an intimacy that no battlefield could offer. Sometimes, though, the room itself contained more than met the eye. Castles were riddled with hidden passageways, false walls, and secret doors. Some knights, especially those of higher rank, had access to concealed chambers where meetings could take place unseen. Imagine standing by the bed and hearing a faint hollow sound as your boot pressed against one flagstone. Beneath it, a trapdoor leading to a stairwell that vanished into the blackness below. These were the spaces where knights conspired, where alliances were forged, or where a forbidden guest could be smuggled in without a soul in the castle knowing. Doesn't it make you wonder what whispers still echo in those hidden stones? Not every chamber was sinister, of course. Some were filled with objects of devotion, small crucifixes on the wall, relics said to be fragments of saints' bones, or charms against evil spirits. Imagine a knight kneeling in front of a tiny altar by his bed, whispering a prayer that mixed equal parts faith and desperation. He might touch the relic and believe that tomorrow's battle would spare his life. But who could truly say whether it was faith or superstition? Behind closed doors, the line between religion and magic blurred like candle smoke. Other chambers revealed habits more earthly. Wine jugs half empty, dice scattered across the table, or a lute propped against the wall for moments of song. In the quiet of night, a knight might strum a clumsy tune, humming softly to drown out the silence. Can you picture it? A man feared on the battlefield, singing off-key like a lonely traveler, his voice echoing strangely in the stone walls. If you listened closely, perhaps you would even laugh, because even the fiercest knight sometimes sang badly enough to frighten the mice. But these rooms also carried a heaviness. They were prisons as much as sanctuaries. The stone walls did not only keep enemies out, they kept the knight in. Outside, the world was wide and filled with possibilities. Inside, the walls pressed close, and the silence forced him to face thoughts he would rather avoid. That is the paradox. Knights were mighty in war, but powerless in solitude. Alone with their own thoughts, they faced the ghosts of those they killed, the weight of oaths they swore, and the gnawing doubt of whether honor was worth the price. Think for a moment, if you were locked in such a chamber after a long day, what would you do? Would you search for the hidden door, curious where it led? Would you kneel at the altar, begging for forgiveness, or would you pour another cup of wine, trying to laugh away the echoes in your mind? Each choice tells a different story, and every knight's room whispered its own truth. Some whispered of faith, others of lust, others still of betrayal. All whispered of humanity. So tonight, as we stand in the shadow of this imagined chamber, let us not just look at the stone walls, let us listen to them. They are speaking. If you dare to hear, stories of secret meetings, of prayers whispered in fear, of laughter muffled in the dark, and of regrets carved deep into the soul of men who wore shining armor by day and hid their frailties by night. And remember, every castle has its secrets, but the most haunting ones live in the rooms where knights closed the door and thought no one was watching. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the chamber once more. The fire in the hearth has dwindled to a faint glow. The air is heavy with the scent of wax and smoke, and the knight sits at the edge of his bed, the weight of the day pressing against his shoulders. This is the moment that often went unseen. The rituals before sleep, private acts that reveal more about the soul of a man than the battles he fought. Some of these rituals were deeply religious. Picture a knight kneeling before a small wooden cross fixed into the stone wall. His hands are calloused. His knees sore from armor, yet he presses them together and whispers words that echo in Latin. Domini, custodi animum meum. Lord, protect my soul. For knights raised in a world of faith, the night was not safe without prayer. They believed demons walked in dreams, and sin could creep into the heart under the cover of darkness. To pray was to build a fortress around the mind. But prayers were not the only rituals. Many knights clung to charms and superstitions, tokens slipped into their pillows or sewn into the lining of their tunics. Some kept tiny relics, the bone fragment of a saint, a pebble said to be blessed, or even the claw of an animal thought to ward off evil. Imagine lifting the mattress and finding not only straw, but a patchwork of odd little protections. The line between religion and magic blurred, and knights often walked both paths at once. Others had habits more practical, if no less strange. Before sleep, a knight might sharpen his sword, even though tomorrow promised no battle. It was not about readiness, but about reassurance. The metallic scrape against the whetstone, soothing as a lullaby. Another might polish his armor until candlelight danced on the steel, as though he feared his very identity would vanish if the shine dulled. These were rituals of control in a world where little could be controlled. And let us not forget the human, even comical aspects. There are accounts of knights muttering to themselves, rehearsing insults they wished they had shouted on the field, or practicing speeches of love they hoped to deliver one day. Some even talked to their armor as though it were a companion. You saved me today. Old friend, don't fail me tomorrow. Imagine walking past their door and hearing that. Would you think him mad, or would you understand the loneliness that drove him to speak with cold steel? Sleep did not come easily. Beneath the rituals was often a restlessness born of fear. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the arrow slits could sound like danger. A knight might seat bolt upright at the faintest sound, hand on his sword, until realizing it was only a mouse or the shifting of stone. For men who lived so close to death, even silence could feel threatening. Now imagine being that knight yourself. You sit on the straw mattress, body aching, eyes heavy. What ritual would you perform? Would you pray for salvation? Clutching the charm around your neck, would you polish your sword, letting the sound lull you into calm? Or would you simply drink from the jug by your bed until sleep finally dragged you under? Each choice speaks to a different kind of knight, and perhaps a different kind of you. These knightly acts were never recorded in ballads. No minstrel sang of a knight mumbling to his sword or hiding a rabbit's foot beneath his pillow. Yet these were the truths of their humanity. They remind us that strength on the battlefield often masked fragility in solitude, behind closed doors. Knights were not marble statues. They were men trying desperately to believe in something, anything that might let them wake to see another dawn. So as the candles burn low and the knight finally stretches out beneath his furs, think about the rituals you yourself cling to before sleep. Are they so different? Maybe your world is not one of swords and castles, but perhaps you too whisper a prayer, check a locked door twice, or scroll through your phone for comfort in the dark. Across centuries, we are not so far from the knight in his chamber, and tomorrow, when he wakes, he must again put on the armor and become the legend. But tonight, for a few fragile hours, he is simply a man seeking peace. The chamber is quiet, the rituals of prayer and superstition finished, yet the night does not always end with folded hands and peaceful sleep. Behind closed doors, another truth waited, one rarely sung in ballads or carved into stone. Knights, for all their vows of chastity, loyalty, and honor, were still men of flesh and blood, and in the silence of their rooms, love and temptation often crept in like shadows slipping through the cracks in the wall. The world outside praised knights as paragons of virtue. They were sworn to serve their lords, to defend the weak, to honor the church, and to remain faithful. But what happens when a man sworn to purity feels the stirrings of desire? Imagine the struggle. A knight kneeling in prayer one moment, then staring at a hidden letter the next. A folded piece of parchment sealed with wax, carrying the perfume of a lady who should never have written it. Would he resist, or would he allow himself a secret smile before tucking it away under the mattress? Medieval romances are full of such stories, tales of knights risking everything for forbidden love, sometimes with noble ladies, sometimes even with the wives of their lords. History hints at scandalous affairs whispered behind heavy curtains. A knight might slip out at night, armor replaced with a cloak, footsteps soft against the stone. Where did he go? To a garden where a candle burned faintly in the window above, to a door unlocked for just a few moments, to a stolen kiss that carried the weight of sin and the thrill of eternity. Temptation was not always so grand, of course. Sometimes it lived in the imagination. Alone in his room, a knight might conjure daydreams of love songs and courtly dances he would never attend. He might trace the name of a woman into the dust on his table, or whisper words to no one at all, just to hear what it sounded like. Think about it. How many times have you rehearsed words you never dared to speak aloud? In that moment, you are closer to the night than you think. And then there were the comedic missteps. Imagine a knight who, after too much wine, tried to compose a love poem but ended up with rhymes so dreadful even the mice scurried away in disgust. Or another who attempted to serenade beneath a balcony, but slipped on wet stones, clattering loudly enough to wake the entire castle. These were not the stories of polished romances, but of clumsy human yearning. Love behind closed doors was rarely graceful. It was awkward, dangerous, and deeply real. For others, temptation came in darker forms. Some knights sought comfort not in the arms of love but in fleeting indulgences, gambling, drinking, or company paid for in coins. In their world, where tomorrow's dawn could bring death, the hunger for pleasure burned even brighter. Was it sin? Was it survival? Perhaps both. Behind closed doors, the knight had to decide whether to uphold his vows or to surrender, just for one night, to the gravity of desire. Now let me ask you, if you bore the weight of armor by day, the expectation of virtue, the watchful eyes of lords and priests, what would you do when the chamber door shut and the world could not see? Would you remain faithful, clinging to the code of chivalry like a lifeline, or would you allow yourself one stolen moment, one dangerous kiss, knowing it could ruin everything if discovered? The temptation was not just about desire. It was about freedom, rebellion, and the quiet rebellion of the heart. The truth is, knights lived with contradictions. They carried swords of justice and hearts of longing. Their rooms were filled with prayers and with sighs. And perhaps that is why their stories still fascinate us. Because beneath the armor of legend lies the same struggle we all face, the pull between what the world expects and what the heart demands. So as the knight lies awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between his vows and his desires, remember, he was not marble, not myth, not untouchable. He was a man, and love, whether pure or forbidden, whether noble or messy, crept through the cracks of even the strongest walls. The chamber, as private as it seemed, was never always a sanctuary. Sometimes it was a council room, a place of hushed voices where the air grew thick with secrets instead of incense. Behind closed doors, knights did not always pray or dream. Some plotted, some whispered of power, some sharpened their ambitions as carefully as their swords. Imagine the scene, the flicker of 3 candles on a wooden table, shadows stretching tall across the walls. A knight leans forward, gauntlets removed, fingers drumming against the oak. Across from him sits another man in a cloak, his face hidden by the hood. Their voices are low, careful, because the wrong word, if overheard, could mean the gallows. This was the hidden theater of medieval politics, played not on the battlefield but in the secrecy of chambers. Not every knight was content to follow orders. Many held their own visions of power. Some dreamed of land promised but never given. Others nursed grudges against their lords, believing themselves more worthy to lead. And so, in the quiet of night, after armor was set aside, plans were spoken that could shake kingdoms. A secret pact sealed with a shared cup of wine, or a whispered oath by candlelight. It might be the beginning of rebellion, or the seed of betrayal that would bloom in blood. There are chronicles that hint at such moments. A knight meeting with a messenger carrying coded letters, delivered under the guise of trade. A scroll hidden in a boot, words written in ink so faint they could only be read by firelight. The chamber was not only a bedroom, it was an office of intrigue. A stage for the kind of theater history books prefer to gloss over. And let us not forget the darker edge of these schemes. Some knights played double games, swearing loyalty to one lord while secretly serving another. They became actors in a play of deception, slipping between roles as easily as they changed their armor. Imagine the weight of that duplicity. By day, saluting your master. By night, conspiring against him. The door closed, the smile faded, and the truth slipped out in whispers no minstrel would ever dare to sing. Of course, not every scheme was grand enough to topple a throne. Some were small, petty even. Whispers about who would marry whom, who might inherit an estate, or who had insulted whose pride at the last feast. In a world where honor was currency, even gossip could become a weapon, and knights, for all their discipline, were not immune to the temptation of plotting advantage in the shadows. Now think of this, if you were such a knight, bound by oaths but tempted by ambition, what would you do? Would you risk everything to conspire for power, believing destiny was on your side, or would you hold your tongue, fearful that one careless word might condemn you? It is easy to imagine knights as pure figures of valor, but behind closed doors they were men wrestling with greed, fear, and hunger for more. And yet irony danced in these rooms too. Some conspiracies were so poorly planned they bordered on comedy. Imagine 2 knights whispering in secret, only to be overheard by a servant carrying wine, or another who hid a letter beneath his mattress, only for his squire to find it and read it aloud in the barracks, causing chaos. History remembers the grand betrayals, But behind every successful plot lay a dozen foolish ones that collapsed before they ever began. The shadows of the chamber remind us that knights lived in a world where loyalty was currency, but betrayal was always close at hand. By day, their swords clashed for glory. By night, their words sharpened into daggers. Which was more dangerous, the steel of the battlefield or the whispers of a chamber where no one was supposed to hear? The armor lies silent in the corner, the helmet resting on the chair, and the candles burn low. For a moment the chamber looks peaceful. But peace is an illusion. When the noise of the battlefield fades and the laughter of the feast dies down, another presence fills the room. Fear. It was the companion no knight ever wished to acknowledge, yet behind closed doors it often sat closest of all. Picture the knight lying back on his straw mattress, staring at the beams above. His body is bruised, but it is his mind that suffers most. The battle may be over, but in the silence of night echoes return. Horses screaming, steel clashing, the last breath of a friend cut down beside him. He closes his eyes, and instead of rest, visions rush back with cruel clarity. Do you know what it is like to fight an enemy you cannot strike with a sword? That was the nightly torment of many nights, memories, nightmares, the ghosts of men they could not save. There are stories of knights waking in the dark, drenched in sweat, clutching their swords as if the enemy were still in the room. Some spoke of dreams so vivid that they believed demons had come to torment them. Medieval society explained these terrors as the work of spirits or the punishment of God. Today we might call it trauma. But whatever the name, the knight felt it the same way you might feel your heart race after a nightmare too real to shake. Fear also came from the future. Would tomorrow bring another battle? Would his luck finally fail? Would he fall not in glory, but forgotten in the mud? Knights carried the weight of reputation. The fear of dishonor perhaps greater than the fear of death itself. Imagine lying awake, not terrified of dying, but of being remembered as a coward. Honor was everything, and the thought of losing it gnawed at them more viciously than the sharpest blade. Even the strongest warriors had private phobias. Some feared sickness, knowing a fever could kill faster than a sword. Others dreaded captivity, the thought of rotting in a dungeon worse than any wound. A few were haunted by superstition, convinced that a shadow across the moon meant doom, or that an owl hooting outside the window was a herald of death. Alone in his chamber, a knight might shiver at these signs, pretending in daylight that he did not believe. But fear cares little for pride. Sometimes fear was almost comical. Imagine a knight who faced down armies but leapt at the sight of a mouse skittering across the floor, or one who boasted of killing men in single combat but nearly fainted at the doctor's knife when a boil had to be lanced. These contradictions made them human. Behind closed doors, even the bravest could be ridiculous, and perhaps in those moments they laughed at themselves, though quietly, so no one else would hear. Now I ask you, what is your hidden fear? If you were the knight lying in the dark, what would haunt you? The faces of enemies, the fear of failure, the sound of death creeping closer? Perhaps you know the answer already. Fear is timeless, crossing centuries. You have yours just as he had his. And in admitting it, perhaps you and the knight are not so different after all. So as the candles burn down to nothing and the shadows crawl along the stone walls, remember this: knights were not fearless. They only wore fear like another layer of armor, hiding it where no one could see, but the chamber knew. The chamber always knew. The knight's chamber was a place of solitude, yes, but sometimes the knight pulled him elsewhere, to the great hall, where shadows of firelight danced on banners and laughter echoed through stone. Not every closed door led to silence. Some opened onto feasts that stretched deep into the night, gatherings where knights, lords, and ladies let the weight of duty slip away. Behind the grandeur, these meals revealed just as much about the hidden life of knights as prayers or fears. Picture a long wooden table heavy with roasted meats, boar glistening with fat, venison seasoned with herbs, bread still steaming from the oven. Wheels of cheese stacked like treasure. Jugs of ale and wine flowed as though rivers had been bottled. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, garlic, and sweat. And into this mix came the knights, freshly scrubbed or perhaps not scrubbed at all, throwing themselves into a kind of ritual just as sacred as prayer: the feast. Here, discipline dissolved. Men who spent the day drilling in formation now slammed their cups on the table in drunken rhythm. Stories grew taller with every refill of wine. One knight boasted of killing 10 enemies with a single swing, though everyone suspected the number doubled each time he told it. Another recited a tale of a duel that ended with his opponent fleeing in terror, though in truth, the man probably just tripped on his own boots. Exaggeration was the sport of the feast, and the louder the laughter, the better the tale. But feasts were not only about food and stories, they were stages for subtle games of power. Who sat nearest the Lord's seat, who was offered the choicest cut of meat? A knight could measure his standing not just by his deeds in battle, but by how far down the table he was placed. Politics, after all, was served alongside the venison. Behind every toast, 100 unspoken calculations swirled. Of course, temptation lingered here too. Eyes met across the table, glances stolen in the shimmer of torchlight. A laugh held a secret meaning. A brush of hands passed like a promise. In the chaos of the feast, moments of intimacy bloomed, and sometimes the wine was strong enough to erase caution, leading to whispers that followed nights back to their chambers. Feasts were also a place of games. Dice rolling across the boards, wagers placed on who could drink the most without collapsing, even bizarre competitions like who could balance a chicken bone longest on their nose. Imagine men in armor, feared on the battlefield, reduced to giggling boys trying to outdo one another in foolish contests. These moments may not appear in chronicles, but they colored the private lives of knights more than the polished legends ever did. Yet the feast also carried a darker edge. A careless insult spoken after too much wine could ignite feuds lasting generations. One night's laughter might hide a grudge. One toast might mask a threat. History tells of banquets ending in sudden violence. Daggers drawn, cups overturned, blood spilled on the same tables that moments before overflowed with food. The feast was joy and danger in equal measure. Now imagine yourself at that table. What would you do? Would you boast louder than the rest, trying to outshine them with tales of bravery? Would you watch the politics unfold in silence, measuring your place by the scraps on your plate? Or would you join in the laughter, letting yourself forget? For a moment, the weight of the world outside, every feast tested not only a knight's appetite, but also his wit, his ambition, and his restraint. Behind closed doors, far from the battlefield, the feast was its own kind of war. A struggle for respect, affection, or survival in the maze of noble politics. And when the last cup was drained and the torches burned low, knights stumbled back to their chambers carrying more than full stomachs. They carried secrets, grudges, whispered promises, and memories of laughter that might be their last before another dawn of blood. The feast is over. The laughter faded into echoes, and most of the castle has drifted into uneasy sleep. Yet not every knight surrendered to slumber. Some, restless and unable to quiet the turmoil of their minds, sought a different kind of ritual, training in silence, behind closed doors. The clang of steel softened to whispers, and the lonely discipline of practice continued long after midnight. Picture a narrow courtyard lit only by the moon, or a chamber cleared of furniture so a man could swing his sword without breaking a candle stand. There, barefoot on cold stone, a knight moved through forms he had drilled since boyhood. Slash, parry, thrust, movements etched into muscle memory. Repeated not for glory but for survival. In silence, the rhythm became almost meditative. The sword was no longer just a weapon. It was a prayer. A confession, a desperate promise to live one more day. Why train in secret when the day was already full of drills? Because for some, discipline was the only way to keep fear at bay. Each swing of the blade was a way of telling themselves, I am ready. I will not falter. In a world where tomorrow could bring an ambush or duel, the knight who trained in silence felt less like prey to chance. Perhaps you know the feeling, the late night urge to check the lock twice, to repeat a task until it feels safe. Their practice was no different, only sharper, heavier, more dangerous. Not all practice was solemn. Some knights, weary of endless repetition, invented strange exercises, balancing on one foot with armor half buckled, sparring against shadows, or racing to see how quickly they could draw a dagger from sleep. Imagine stumbling upon such a sight, a grim knight hopping like a rooster in the moonlight, muttering curses each time he slipped. Behind the solemn legends lived men who sometimes looked quite foolish. Others turned practice into a test of endurance, holding a sword aloft until their arms trembled, kneeling in the same stance until their legs went numb. These trials were not for spectators. No applause, no music, just the sound of labored breath echoing against stone. If someone had asked why, the knight might have shrugged. He was preparing for a battle that might never come, but also for the inner battle against weakness itself. And then there were those who practiced with younger squires after hours, Behind closed doors, they became teachers, barking commands softened by private laughter, pushing the boys to exhaustion but slipping them scraps of food when no one was watching. These late-night lessons built bonds stronger than the finest steel. When dawn came, those squires would follow their knights into fire, because loyalty had been forged not just in war, but in these quiet hours of sweat and shared bread. Training in silence also carried a spiritual weight. To move the sword in the stillness of night was to commune with ghosts, the memory of mentors long gone, the echo of duels that shaped the man. Every strike was both practice and prayer, a way of saying, "I have not forgotten. I will not fail you." Perhaps you too know that feeling when you repeat something in solitude, not because anyone demands it, but because you owe it to yourself, or to someone you once promised. Now imagine being that knight. Everyone else is asleep, yet you are awake, barefoot, body aching, swinging steel in the moonlight. Would you feel powerful? Or merely desperate? Would you sense the satisfaction of control, or the gnawing fear that no matter how much you practice, fate can still betray you? In that question lies the heart of the knight's humanity, discipline mixed with doubt, strength braided with fragility. So while stories remember knights clashing in tournaments, their truest battles were often fought here, in the lonely silence of midnight practice, where no bard sang, no crowd cheered, and no reward was given. Only the knight knew, and the stone walls listened. We often imagine knights as solemn figures, stiff with discipline and iron-bound by codes of honor. Yet when the doors of the chamber closed and the armor was hung aside, another side of them emerged, rowdy, mischievous, sometimes downright ridiculous. Humor was not a luxury but a survival tool, and behind closed doors, laughter became as necessary as prayer. Picture a group of knights gathered around a small table, mugs of ale in hand. The air is thick with smoke and the smell of sweat still clings to them, but their voices rise in laughter. One tells a crude joke about a rival lord's bald head. Another mimics the pompous voice of the bishop who gave a too long sermon earlier that day. Even the most disciplined knight found release in such rough jests. To fight death by day and sit in silence by night was unbearable. Humor filled the void. These jokes were rarely polite. Imagine men who spent their lives in blood and mud. They did not laugh at delicate riddles. Their humor was rough, physical, often mocking themselves as much as each other. A knight might stumble while removing his greaves and be teased for fighting his own armor harder than his enemies. Another might wake with straw sticking in his beard, only to be called Lord Haystack for weeks. Nicknames born in jest clung longer than titles won in battle. There were practical jokes too. Helmets filled with cold water, boots hidden in rafters, beds swapped so one poor man awoke in a pigsty rather than his chamber. Some tricks went too far, ending in bruised pride or even duels, but most were forgiven with laughter because to be a knight was to live always near death. A prank, even a cruel one, was proof that life still held room for play. Laughter also served as a bond. Knights who fought side by side needed more than discipline. They needed trust, affection, and the kind of familiarity only shared laughter brings. A night of jokes could strengthen loyalty more than a dozen oaths. Think of your own life. Is not it the laughter you remember most vividly? More than speeches or ceremonies, for knights it was the same. Yet humor often masked pain. Behind every roaring laugh might be a memory too heavy to face sober. Jokes about death, about scars, about the priest's endless warnings of hell. They were ways of whistling in the dark. If you laugh at death, perhaps it cannot touch you. If you mock your wounds, perhaps they do not sting. Knights turned fear into jest, because the alternative was despair. There are accounts of knights turning even their losses into humor. One might boast, "The scar on my leg was from a dragon," though in truth it came from falling off a horse. Another might declare, "I only lost that duel because the sun blinded me," though everyone knew he had simply tripped. These were not lies meant to deceive, but stories meant to lighten the burden. Behind closed doors, knights rewrote their failures into comedy, and in doing so, reclaimed a measure of dignity. Now imagine being in that room. Would you join the laughter, letting go of your pride and mocking yourself as freely as others mocked you? Or would you sit stiffly, unable to bear the humiliation of being the butt of a joke? Humor demanded courage of its own, the courage to be vulnerable, to be foolish, to admit that even knights were clowns in their own way. So remember this, knights were not statues of marble. They were men who tripped, laughed, cursed, and sometimes made fools of themselves. Behind the solemn stories of battles, there were moments of roaring laughter that echoed louder than swords, and perhaps those moments mattered more than we realize. For laughter was not only relief, it was survival. By day, knights spoke the language of steel, commands shouted on the field, oaths proclaimed before lords, and challenges roared across jousting grounds. But when the chamber door closed and the candles burned low, many spoke in another language entirely. The private trembling words of love and the solemn weight of oaths whispered in the dark. Imagine a knight at a small wooden desk, quill in hand, struggling to find words. He had faced men with swords, yet now he faced parchment with equal fear. How does one confess longing without betraying weakness? How does a man sworn to duty admit that his heart aches for someone he should not desire? Slowly, ink scratches across the page. Sometimes the letters are neat, disciplined as the man himself. Other times the lines wobble, blurred by wine or tears. These letters, rarely intended for the world, were as dangerous as any blade. Some were innocent, written to wives far away, promises of return, reassurances of love, prayers for their children's health. Others were dangerous, addressed to forbidden loves smuggled by servants or tucked into the pages of prayer books. Imagine the risk. One intercepted letter could ruin reputations, spark feuds, or cost a knight his life, yet still they wrote because silence was heavier than danger. Not all letters were sent. Many knights kept them hidden in chests or beneath mattresses, folded and refolded until the paper wore thin. They were confessions never spoken aloud. Safety valves for emotions a man could not risk showing even to his closest brothers. If you opened one of those chests, what would you find? Words of devotion, fiery and reckless, or careful lines, written with more restraint than passion, as though the knight feared the ink itself might betray him. And beyond letters came oaths, promises carved not in ink but in the heart. Some knights swore before relics, binding themselves to protect a love in secret. Others whispered oaths into the night air, speaking to no one but God, or perhaps to the memory of someone lost. Oaths could be noble, pledges of eternal loyalty. But they could also be reckless, promises made in moments of passion that no man could truly keep. I will never betray you. I will always return. Beautiful words, but in a world where tomorrow was not guaranteed, often impossible to fulfill. There was irony too. The same mouth that swore fealty to a lord in the daylight might whisper devotion to a lover at night. The same man who promised to serve God with purity might hide a poem in his pocket that spoke of earthly desire. Knights lived with these contradictions, balancing their public oaths and their private ones, praying the two worlds would never collide. Humor crept in even here. Imagine a knight, awkward with words, writing a love letter so clumsy it sounded more like a battle report. My lady, today I struck 3 foes and thought of you with each blow. Or another who accidentally sealed his letter with the wax of his lord's crest, nearly exposing his secret. Behind the drama of history, there were moments of comic absurdity that made these knights as human as any modern fool fumbling over a text message. Now imagine yourself in his place. Would you risk writing such a letter, knowing discovery could destroy you? Would you swear an oath you could not guarantee to keep, just to ease the ache in your heart? Or would you bury your feelings, letting them eat away at you in silence? These choices reveal more about the knight than any battle could. So when you picture the knight in his chamber, do not only see the sword and shield, see the ink-stained fingers, the folded parchment, the lips moving in vows no one else would ever hear. These fragile tokens of love and loyalty remind us that behind every myth of steel was a heart desperate to be heard, even if only by paper, candlelight, and the shadows of the night. A knight's life was carved by steel and scarred by wounds. Behind closed doors, when the cheering faded and the battlefield glory was gone, the body demanded attention. What songs never told, what chronicles rarely recorded, were the private rituals of healing and the strange practices of medieval medicine that shaped every knight's. Picture the chamber, armor piled in the corner, bandages laid across the table, a jug of cloudy wine repurposed as disinfectant. A knight sits shirtless, examining a slash across his ribs in the mirror of a polished shield. The wound is crude, ugly, yet familiar. For knights, injury was not an exception but a constant companion. Every scar carried a story, but also pain that lingered long after applause died. How did they treat such wounds, often with methods that sound more like superstition than science? Honey smeared over cuts, believed to purify. Herbs ground into pastes, their effects guessed at by trial and error. vinegar poured into gashes, burning like fire but thought to drive out corruption. Imagine the hiss of pain, the gritted teeth, the whispered curse as a squire dabbed raw flesh with remedies that healed as often as they harmed. Leeches and bloodletting were common too. A knight fevered from infection might be bled in hopes that sickness would drain with the crimson flow. Some wrapped talismans around wounds, believing words carved into bone or metal could banish illness. Others trusted in charms placed under pillows, convinced that dreams themselves could carry away disease. To us it seems absurd, but in their world, when death lurked in every cough, any hope was worth clinging to. Their bodies bore more than cuts. Bruises darkened their skin, bones cracked beneath the weight of armor. Arthritis crept into joints too early. Backs bent from years of riding. In silence, knights groaned as they stretched sore muscles, massaged swollen knees, or tied cloths soaked in herbs around their arms. These knightly acts of care were never sung in tales, yet they mattered as much as any sword swing. And then there were the stranger remedies. Powdered horn of animals thought to grant strength. Dried frog worn in a pouch believed to cure seizures. Some even drank concoctions of wine mixed with crushed pearls, chasing immortality through luxury. Imagine the taste, gritty, bitter, and utterly useless. But desperation can make fools of even the bravest men. Not every attempt was foolish. Some remedies worked by accident. Honey did fight infection, garlic had antibacterial qualities, and willow bark soothed pain much like modern aspirin. Yet knights did not understand why. They only knew what seemed to help. Behind closed doors, medicine was a blend of truth and error, hope and guesswork. The body also carried burdens less visible. Nightmares gnawed at minds, exhaustion pulled heavy on limbs. Some knights confessed that no wound hurt worse than loneliness. To mend that, they sought warmth of fire, of drink, of companionship. Healing was not only physical but emotional, a truth as real then as now. Imagine yourself as the knight. You have survived the battle, but your arm throbs, your head pounds, your chest burns with fever. Do you trust the herbs, the prayers, the knife that bleeds you in hope, or do you simply grit your teeth and wait? Survival was never guaranteed. Each night's healing was a gamble with death. So the next time you picture a knight shining in armor, remember the body beneath, bruised, aching, stitched together by crude medicine and stubborn will. Behind the glory of chivalry was the secret world of wounds tended in candlelight, of whispered prayers over broken bones, of men too proud to cry out but too human not to suffer. These were the hidden truths of their bodies, and they remind us that every legend limped, bled, and longed for healing. By day, knights wagered their lives in battlefields and tournaments, but when the doors of their chambers closed, another kind of gamble began. Games of chance, contests of daring, and reckless challenges whispered through smoke and laughter. Behind the shining image of chivalry lurked a taste for risk that no code of honor could restrain. Imagine a table scattered with dice carved from bone, their edges worn smooth by countless throws. A knight leans forward, eyes narrowed, lips murmuring prayers half serious, half mocking. As he lets the dice roll across the wood, the clatter fills the chamber, louder than the crackling fire. Around him, others jeer, cheer, or groan depending on fortune's whim. Here, skill meant little. Chance ruled, and even the bravest warrior was humbled by a pair of tumbling cubes. Cards, too, found their way into these secret games, painted decks smuggled across trade routes, delicate yet dangerous. A knight might bet a month's pay on a hand. Or worse, wager his armor, his horse, even the sword at his hip. Losses stung, but the thrill was intoxicating. In a world where death lurked daily, why not flirt with ruin by night? Yet not all games were played with dice and cards. Some tested courage in stranger ways. One knight might dare another to walk barefoot across the cold battlements under moonlight. Another might wager who could drain a jug of wine fastest without collapsing. Still another challenge might turn darker, tests of who could hold a hand over flame longest, or who dared draw blood from their own skin without flinching. Imagine the mixture of laughter, groans, and the acrid smell of burnt flesh. What to us seems madness was for them proof of nerve. The games could spiral quickly. A prank-turned contest might end with bruises. A drunken wager might spark a duel at dawn. History records tournaments and formal combats. But behind closed doors, reckless challenges claimed their own hidden victims, and unlike battle, there was no honor in losing to dice or wine. Why did they do it? Perhaps boredom, trapped in stone walls with nothing but time. Perhaps pride, each knight desperate to prove himself braver than the rest. Or perhaps it was defiance, a way of laughing at death, saying, "If fate wants me, it must do better than a bad throw of dice." These games were rebellion disguised as entertainment. There was humor too, of course. Imagine a knight so drunk he bet his boots only to wake barefoot in the courtyard the next morning. Or one who swore he could balance his sword on his nose, only to knock over half the candles and nearly set the chamber ablaze. Laughter roared, even as servants scurried to save the tapestries from flames. But beneath the laughter lingered tension. A knight who lost too much might find himself in debt, honor fraying faster than his purse. A reckless challenge might leave scars worse than battle. Behind the games lurked the same truths as war, risk, pride, and the thin line between triumph and disaster. Now ask yourself, would you join them? Would you roll dice, bet your belongings, laugh in the face of ruin, or would you sit back, wary that one careless wager could undo years of loyalty and reputation? The games reveal the same thing the battlefield does: who dares, who bluffs, who falters. So the next time you imagine knights as paragons of solemn virtue, remember the nights when dice clattered louder than hymns, when dares burned hotter than prayers, and when men who faced death daily still sought its shadow for sport. Dangerous games, they were both foolish and profound, teaching knights that honor might shine in battle. But in private, fate could be crueler still. The chamber grows silent. The laughter of games fades, the clatter of dice is gone, and only the slow burn of candles remains. In that quiet, the weight of sins presses down harder than armor. For many nights, the night was not only for sleep or merriment, it was the hour of confession. Behind closed doors, they whispered to priests or prayed into the shadows, desperate to unburden their souls before dawn. Picture a small chapel hidden inside the castle, lit by a single lamp. A knight kneels, hands trembling, speaking to the priest through a carved wooden screen. His voice is low, thick with shame. He confesses what he cannot admit to his comrades, the lies told, vows broken, the blood spilled not in justice but in anger. The priest listens, silent, then offers penance, prayers to be repeated, alms to be given. The knight bows his head, knowing forgiveness is promised, yet still unsure if his heart feels lighter. But confession did not always require a priest. Many knights confessed alone, kneeling beside their beds, whispering sins into the dark. They believed God heard even in silence. Some pounded their chests, repeating the Latin phrase, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, my fault, my greatest fault. Tears fell onto stone floors. Unseen by others, but powerful all the same, these were moments of raw humanity. Men who looked invincible in battle, reduced to trembling souls at night. What sins weighed most heavily for some, it was the killing of innocents, peasants caught in raids, bystanders struck in rage. For others, it was betrayal, of vows to their lords, of promises to their loves, of oaths to God himself. Some confessed temptations, lusts, and drunken excesses. Others admitted to envy, greed, or cowardice. Each sin carved deeper than any sword wound, for it threatened not the body, but the eternal soul. And yet confession was not always solemn. Humor sometimes crept in even here. There are tales of knights confessing absurd sins, stealing extra pies from the kitchen, cursing their horses when they stumbled, or falling asleep during Mass. Imagine the priest trying to maintain a stern face while hearing such confessions. For every grave sin, there were petty ones too, reminding us that knights were no holier than any man. Still, the act mattered. Confession was a ritual of cleansing, a way to reset the soul after days soaked in violence and temptation. To believe in forgiveness was to survive. Without it, guilt might crush a knight before any enemy's blade. Even if doubts lingered, the ritual itself gave strength. Now imagine yourself kneeling in that dark chamber. You have fought, lied, loved where you should not, broken promises you swore to keep. Do you whisper your sins aloud, hoping someone or someone will listen? Or do you keep silent, letting the weight press heavier each night? The choice mirrors the knight's own, to seek forgiveness or to hide from it. So remember, behind the legends of honor and steel were men who trembled in the dark, confessing to shadows and priests, hoping the words would wash them clean. Confession was not weakness. It was the courage to face oneself, and perhaps that courage was rarer than any found on the battlefield. The chamber, quiet and dim, was not always a place of rest. For many nights, sleep itself became a battlefield. Behind closed doors, the mind opened to visions, dreams, nightmares, and strange omens that seemed to whisper of futures yet to come. In a world where faith and superstition wove tightly together, dreams were never dismissed as mere illusions. They were messages, signs, sometimes blessings, sometimes curses. Picture a knight twisting beneath his furs, murmuring in sleep. His body is exhausted, yet his mind runs wild. He sees himself standing on a field of crows, their black wings blotting the sky. He wakes gasping, convinced it is a warning of death to come. Another dreams of drinking from a golden chalice overflowing with wine and believes fortune will favor him. For nights every dream carried weight, a hidden script of destiny written by unseen hands. Chroniclers recorded many such visions. A knight might dream of his sword shattering and fear it foretold his defeat. Another might dream of riding a white horse and take it as a promise of victory. Some dreams were so vivid they shaped real choices, whether to fight, whether to travel, even whether to trust a comrade. Imagine making life or death decisions based not on logic, but on the shadows of sleep. Yet in their world such faith was not foolish. It was survival in a cosmos they believed alive with signs. Dreams were often shared in whispers. In the morning, knights might recount them over bread and ale, gauging reactions. Was the dream a divine warning or just the result of too much wine? Priests and wise women were sometimes called to interpret, each with their own symbols. Ravens meant war. Fire meant purification. Water meant cleansing or danger. Interpretations varied, but the belief remained firm. Dreams were never meaningless. Superstition turned sleep into ritual. Some knights slept with relics under their pillows, hoping for visions sent by saints. Others feared nightmares so deeply that they hung charms over their beds, sprigs of herbs, carved runes, even bones of animals believed to ward off demons. Imagine lying down each night, uncertain whether rest would bring peace or terror. For knights, dreams were not private. They were another battlefield, and sometimes a trial worse than steel. There were moments of humor too. A knight might wake, convinced he would dreamed of meeting an angel, only to realize the heavenly choir was just his comrades snoring in chorus. Or another might recount a terrifying vision of drowning, only to be mocked for spilling wine all over himself in his sleep. Dreams could frighten, but they also became fodder for jokes once daylight broke. Still, the power of dreams could not be denied. Some knights carried their omens like shields, convinced that survival depended on heeding the visions. Others scoffed outwardly but secretly feared what they had seen, and sometimes, chillingly, dreams seemed to come true. A knight who dreamt of his death on the eve of battle might indeed fall the next day, and whispers spread. The dream was fate itself. Now imagine yourself in that bed of straw. You dream of standing before a locked gate, hearing distant battle but unable to move. Is it a warning of betrayal? Or just your mind replaying the day's anxiety? Would you laugh it off or wake in sweat, convinced destiny had spoken? In that choice lies the fragile line between superstition and sanity. So remember, when you picture knights behind closed doors, do not only see armor piled in the corner. See the restless figures tossing in sleep. See the whispered stories at dawn. See the fear and hope bound in dreams. For in their world the night did not bring escape, it brought omens. And those omens could rule a man's heart more firmly than any lord. A knight's chamber was more than a place to sleep. It was a vault of secrets, behind closed doors, beneath straw mattresses, inside wooden chests. And even scratched into the walls, knights hid truths that never appeared in ballads or chronicles. Some were small, some dangerous, and some so shameful that discovery would mean ruin. Picture a chest at the foot of the bed, iron-bound, its key kept close on a leather cord. Inside might be a jumble of objects, a crumpled letter from a forbidden love, a purse of coins meant for bribes, a dagger etched with a rival's crest, each item a story, each story a risk. To open that chest was to peer into the knight's private life, one far more complex than the simple tales of loyalty and honor. Some secrets were written, scratched into parchment or carved into wood. Journals, though rare, did exist, scribbled notes where knights confessed thoughts they dared not voice. One might write of doubts about his lord, another of fear of death, another of sins unconfessed. Imagine discovering such words centuries later, realizing that the man behind the armor was no more certain, no more invincible, than you. Others hid relics, not always holy. A scrap of cloth from a lover, a lock of hair tied in ribbon, even bones or charms thought to bring power. To carry these openly was dangerous, but to hide them gave comfort. Knights lived in contradiction, sworn to purity, yet clinging to tokens of desire. Sworn to faith, yet holding talismans that flirted with superstition. Secrets were not only of love or fear. Some knights concealed wealth skimmed from campaigns, coins slipped into pouches before lords could claim their share. Others hid trophies, rings, weapons, or even the teeth of enemies, grim reminders of victories too dark to celebrate in public. To boast of such things would break the code. To keep them hidden was safer, though the guilt weighed heavy. And then there were the whispered secrets of identity. A knight might hide doubts about his birth, rumors of illegitimacy, or shame over a cowardly act. Some disguised wounds that never healed, wearing padding to hide weakness. To the world they shone as paragons of strength, but in private. They concealed truths that could destroy reputations built on steel. Secrets could be practical too. A knight might stash away forbidden books, manuals of strategy, texts of heresy, or even romances frowned upon by priests. Imagine a man who spent the day reciting prayers, yet read tales of pagan heroes by candlelight. To him, these stories were not rebellion, but escape, yet if discovered, they could brand him traitor to faith. Not all secrets were dark. Some were silly, even tender. A knight might practice poetry in secret, hiding clumsy verses beneath armor polish. Another might keep a wooden toy from childhood, too embarrassed to admit he still carried it. These small tokens, though harmless, revealed the fragile humanity beneath the steel mask. Now imagine yourself as that knight. What would you hide in your chamber? A letter you cannot send, a treasure you cannot spend, a truth you cannot speak. Every secret was both protection and prison. The chest at the foot of the bed held not just objects but fragments of a man's soul, locked away for fear of the world's judgment. So when we think of knights, let us not only see banners waving in glory. Let us see the locked chests, the folded parchments, the whispered vows to shadows. For behind closed doors, knights carried not only swords but secrets, and sometimes those secrets cut deeper than any blade. Behind every knight stood not only armor and weapons, but also the silent presence of servants. These squires and attendants moved quietly through the chambers, carrying water, polishing steel, lighting candles. They were meant to be invisible, yet it was often their eyes that saw what no ballad ever dared to sing. Behind closed doors, the servants knew. Picture a young squire entering the chamber at dusk, carrying a basin of water. He sets it down, head bowed, but cannot help noticing the knight's trembling hands as he removes his gauntlets. Later, he hears muffled prayers, or catches a glimpse of parchment hastily tucked beneath a mattress. He is not meant to watch, but how can he not? The chamber was as much his workplace as the knight's refuge, and every secret left traces. Servants witnessed the raw humanity hidden from the world. They saw knights wince as wounds were cleaned, curse softly at the sting of vinegar, or groan with fatigue as they collapsed into bed. They heard confessions muttered in sleep, dreams shouted in terror, and sometimes even names whispered with longing. To the world the knight was a statue of strength. To the servant he was a man stitched together by scars, faith, and fear. Not all sights were noble. Some squires fetched wine until their master could barely stand. Others smuggled letters to forbidden loves, acting as the secret messengers of risky affairs. Imagine a boy no older than 15 slipping a folded note into a lady's hand while pretending to deliver a tray of bread. In that moment, he held the knight's fate in his palm. If caught, punishment would be brutal for both servant and master. There were moments of humor too. Servants often witnessed the clumsy, embarrassing side of knights. A proud warrior stuck halfway while wriggling out of his armor. A knight snoring so loudly that mice fled the chamber. Or one who, after too much ale, mistook a helmet for a chamber pot. These scenes were never recorded in history, but they lived forever in the quiet smirks of those who saw them. Yet servants also carried dangerous knowledge. They knew which knights quarreled in whispers, which cheated at dice, which kept relics hidden in drawers. Loyalty mattered, squires swore service, and many guarded their master's secrets fiercely. But trust was fragile. A single betrayal, a single careless word spoken in the wrong ear, could end a knight's career or his life. Imagine yourself as such a servant. Would you keep every secret bearing the weight of another man's sins, or would you use what you knew to bargain for safety? Perhaps even power. The knight might believe his chamber private, but in truth it was never empty. Someone always watched, always listened. History rarely mentions these witnesses. Chronicles tell of kings and knights, but not of the boy who held the basin, the maid who swept the floor, the man who carried torches. Yet their memories were archives of truth, richer than parchment. If only they had written, how different our stories of knights would be. So remember this: behind closed doors, the knight was never entirely alone. The servant's eyes saw the cracks in the armor, the flaws in the legend. They remind us that history is not only what the mighty chose to reveal, but also what the silent observed and carried away. Night in a medieval castle was never fully silent. The wind moaned through arrow slits, torches hissed as they burned, and sometimes from behind the thick stone walls voices carried softly, knights speaking in low tones long after the hall had emptied. These were the conversations that never made it into chronicles. Yet they revealed more truth than any oath sworn at dawn. Picture two knights sitting by the fading glow of a hearth, armor set aside, only tunics and tired eyes remaining. One leans forward, whispering of a fear he would never confess in daylight, that he dreads the next battle, that he sometimes dreams of running away. The other listens, nods, and admits his own doubts. Between them, silence grows warm with understanding. Behind closed doors, pride loosens and words flow more freely than wine. Some conversations turned philosophical. Knights debated the justice of wars they fought, wondering if God truly blessed their cause or if they were pawns in a lord's ambition. Imagine men trained to kill asking each other whether heaven truly awaited them, or whether hell opened wider with every sword stroke. These questions rarely had answers, but speaking them aloud gave comfort. Others were lighter, even playful. Knights teased each other about clumsy mistakes, retold jokes picked up from peasants, or argued about who sang worst during Mass. In those moments, laughter bounced against the stone walls, and the grim weight of duty lifted, if only for an hour. It was in these midnight talks that camaraderie was forged more deeply than in combat. Secrets often slipped out too. A knight might confess love for a woman he could never marry, or guilt over a duel fought unfairly. Another might reveal that he feared not death but obscurity, that his name would vanish, forgotten by history. These admissions, whispered in trust, tied knights together in fragile webs of honesty. And though they laughed and drank, each man carried the words carefully, knowing to betray them would break bonds more sacred than oaths. Imagine the young squire outside the chamber, hearing muffled laughter, then sudden silence, then hushed voices again. He could never know the weight of what was said inside. For knights, these midnight conversations were a release, a way to share burdens too heavy to carry alone. There were times when words grew darker, confessions of cruelty, regrets that clung like ghosts, questions of whether the code of chivalry was even real. Some admitted they envied the simple life of farmers, free of politics and endless wars. Others admitted they feared growing old more than dying young. Candles burned low as these truths poured out, flickering light on faces that looked suddenly older, more human, less legendary. And yet, amid the heaviness, humor always returned. Someone might break tension with a ridiculous story of misplacing his sword or falling into a ditch while drunk. Laughter shattered the gloom, reminding them they were not just warriors but men, flawed and foolish like anyone else. Now place yourself in that circle, sitting on a rough wooden stool, cup of wine in hand. What would you admit in the safety of night? That you fear disgrace more than wounds? That you long for home more than glory? Or would you stay silent, afraid even in trust to bare your soul? These choices mirror the knight's own, where honesty was as risky as battle. So when you imagine knights, remember not only the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel, but also the murmur of midnight voices, confessions, jokes, doubts, and dreams echoing against stone. For in those fragile hours, knights were not symbols of chivalry, but men bound together by words spoken in the dark. Steel and silence were not the only companions of knights. Behind closed doors, when the clamor of battle faded and the duties of the day ended, music filled the emptiness. It was not the fanfare of trumpets in tournaments or the booming of drums in parades. No, this was softer, songs hummed beneath breath, strings plucked in firelight, voices echoing quietly off stone walls. For knights, music was both escape and confession, a language that carried what words could not. Picture a knight sitting on a wooden stool, a lute resting across his knees. His fingers, calloused from gripping swords, move awkwardly over the strings, coaxing a hesitant tune. It is clumsy, imperfect, but heartfelt. In the corner, a squire listens, wide-eyed, astonished that the same man who thundered across battlefields now whispered stories. Through music, the chamber glows with firelight, and for a moment war seems far away. Sometimes the songs were prayers, hymns sung in Latin, their words half remembered but deeply felt. A knight might sing alone, voice rough yet trembling with devotion, believing that music reached God more quickly than speech. Other times the songs were bawdy, filled with crude jokes and laughter, the kind that servants blushed at but could not help repeating. Later, between the sacred and the profane, music swung like a pendulum, reflecting the contradictions of their lives. Knights also invited traveling minstrels into their chambers, paying them to play while wine flowed. These musicians carried stories from far-off lands, ballads of heroes, tragedies of love, and comic tales of fools. Imagine lying back on furs, listening to a stranger's voice carry you beyond stone walls to places you would never see. For men trapped by duty, music was a doorway to freedom. There was humor, too, in their attempts at music. One knight might boast he could sing better than the choir, only to bellow so loudly that even the dogs howled. Another might try to keep rhythm by banging a tankard on the table, only to spill half the wine and send everyone into fits of laughter. Music was not always beautiful, but it was always human. Yet music also carried danger. A secret song about forbidden love might betray a knight's heart if overheard. A political ballad sung in jest might be taken as treason. Even so, they risked it because silence was heavier than fear. A single verse sung in secret could mean more to them than hours of shouting commands in battle. Imagine yourself there, the chamber warm with fire, voices rising together. Would you join the hymn, eyes closed in devotion? Would you laugh along with a crude song, tankard raised high? Or would you sit quietly, letting the strings and voices wash over you, healing wounds words could not touch? So when you picture knights, do not only imagine steel and solemn oaths. See them plucking strings with rough fingers, humming half-forgotten tunes, or laughing as a lute string snapped at the worst possible moment. In music, they revealed their truest selves, not warriors, not legends, but men searching for solace in sound. The knight's chamber could be solemn with prayer or soft with music, but on many nights it was filled with something louder, wilder, and far less holy. The roar of drinking. Behind closed doors, casks were cracked open, goblets overflowed, and laughter shook the stone walls. Wine and ale were not only drink. They were escape, rebellion, and sometimes self-destruction. Picture a long wooden table pushed against the wall, covered with jugs, tankards, and half-eaten bread. Knights sit shoulder to shoulder, flushed and laughing, slamming cups down so hard the sound echoes like drums. A squire scrambles back and forth, refilling goblets as quickly as they empty. In the corner, a lute player strums frantically, trying to be heard above the noise. This was no feast with priests or lords watching, this was freedom. Unchained. Drinking carried its own rituals. Toasts were raised to fallen comrades, to victories, to the beauty of women they might never see again. Each toast grew louder, more absurd, until men swore they would live forever, or that the moon itself bowed to their courage. The deeper the cups, the higher the boasts, and the more fragile the line between joy and chaos. Sometimes the drinking turned into contests: who could drain a jug the fastest, who could still stand after 5 rounds, who could recite a prayer without slurring. Imagine the cheers, the pounding fists on the table, the collapse of one knight under the bench, while another staggered on, arms raised in triumph. Pride was at stake, and in these games victory could mean little more than staying conscious. But alcohol loosened more than laughter. Tongues slipped, secrets spilled. A knight might confess his doubts, his forbidden loves, his anger toward his lord. All things he would never admit in daylight. Some quarrels began with drunken honesty, then flared into brawls. More than one scar was born not of battle, but of wine-soaked fists in the dark. Humor thrived in such nights. A knight might attempt to dance, only to topple into the firewood pile. Another might mistake his helmet for a cup and try to drink from it. Servants often smirked as they carried away masters too drunk to walk, armor clanking with every step. These stories traveled farther than they should, becoming legends, not of glory but of foolishness. Yet beneath the laughter lurked danger. A drunken insult could spark a feud. A rash promise shouted over wine could bind a knight to reckless vows. And too much drink dulled senses, leaving chambers vulnerable to betrayal or attack. Still, they drank, because sobriety meant facing fears. And wine turned fear into fire. Now imagine yourself among them. The goblet is in your hand, the fire roars, your comrades cheer for another toast. Do you drink deep, risking shame and foolishness? Do you laugh until tears blur your vision, or do you hold back, wary of the ruin that waits in the bottom of the cup? The choice was the same then as it is now. Wine could free you or undo you. So when you think of knights, do not only picture solemn prayers and shining armor. Picture flushed faces, slurred voices, songs shouted off-key, and a chamber spinning with drink. For in those nights of wine and madness, the knights revealed another truth, that even legends sometimes drowned their doubts in laughter, in chaos and in cups raised too high. Not every word written by knights was meant to be read. Some letters never reached their destination. They stayed folded in chests hidden beneath straw, or burned before dawn. Behind closed doors, these unsent letters carried the weight of secrets too dangerous, too tender, or too shameful to share. Picture a knight at a small table, quill scratching over parchment. He begins with bold words, "My beloved," or "To the Lord whom I cannot serve," but then pauses. The ink blots as he hesitates, heart caught between duty and desire. He writes furiously for an hour, pouring out everything he cannot speak aloud. Then, as dawn approaches, he folds the parchment, seals it with wax, and locks it away instead of sending it. The words remain, but the world will never hear them. Some of these letters were declarations of love, written to women they could not marry, to forbidden lovers whose names could never be spoken. Others were letters of anger, drafts of rebellion against lords or kings. Still others were confessions, apologies written to comrades lost in battle. As though the dead could read the ink, each unsent letter was both a wound and a balm. Why not send them? Because to send was to risk everything. A love letter could mean scandal, dishonor, even death. A letter of defiance could brand a knight as traitor. And an apology to the dead, of course, could never find its reader. So the letters stayed hidden, their power locked inside fragile parchment. Imagine finding such a letter centuries later, tucked between the pages of a prayer book. You unfold it, the ink faded but still legible. Suddenly the knight is alive again, not as a hero in shining armor, but as a man trembling with longing, rage, or regret. The unsent letter becomes a time capsule, preserving emotions too raw to survive public life. There was irony here. Knights were men of action, famed for deeds, not words, yet when their hands held quills instead of swords, the truths of their hearts spilled out. Perhaps they never intended those words to be seen. Perhaps writing them was enough. In the quiet of night, parchment became confessor, candlelight became companion, ink became the vessel of inspoken soul. Not all letters were solemn. Some were clumsy, even humorous. A knight might attempt poetry, producing verses so bad he laughed at himself before tearing the page. Another might write a boastful letter about his victories, only to realize how absurd it sounded and crumple it up in embarrassment, even in secrecy. Knights were human, fumbling with words just as they fumbled with love, faith, and fear. Now imagine yourself as that knight. What would you write if you knew no one would ever read it? A confession of love you dare not speak, a curse against someone too powerful to oppose, or a simple admission of fear. I am tired, I am afraid, I am lonely. Would you hide it, burn it, or keep it close, trusting paper to carry the truth you cannot bear to carry alone? So when you picture knights, do not only see armor and banners. See the folded letters, sealed but unsent, lying forgotten in wooden boxes. They are silent witnesses to the fact that even the fiercest warriors sometimes longed not for glory, but simply for someone to read their heart. A knight's chamber was never truly empty. Even when doors were bolted and candles burned low, many believed unseen eyes lingered in the corners, watching. Behind closed doors, knights faced not only their own doubts but also the ghosts of memory, specters of the slain, the fallen, the betrayed. Picture a knight lying awake on his straw mattress. The hall is quiet, the fire crackles faintly, and then he hears footsteps, too soft to belong to living men, too heavy for rats. His heart races as he grips the dagger by his bed. The sound stops, the shadows hold their breath. Was it imagination? Or something else, something he cannot fight with steel? Knights lived in a world where faith and superstition blurred. Ghost stories were not dismissed as childish. They were warnings. Some swore they saw the faces of slain enemies at the foot of their beds, eyes burning with accusation. Others claimed to wake with the weight of an unseen body pressing on their chest, breath stolen by spirits. A knight might laugh at such tales in daylight, but in the silence of night, fear whispered louder. Sometimes the ghosts were comrades. A fallen brother in arms, dead in battle, might appear in dreams or in the corner of the chamber. Some knights welcomed these visions, taking them as signs of loyalty beyond the grave. Others shuddered, wondering if the ghost had returned not to comfort but to remind them of failures. The arrow not blocked, the sword not raised in time. And then there were the hauntings of guilt. A knight who killed in anger might hear the cries of his victim at night. Another who betrayed a vow might feel a cold hand brush his shoulder when he prayed. These experiences, whether real or imagined, carved deeper wounds than swords ever could. For knights, ghosts were not only phantoms of death, but phantoms of conscience. Humor slipped in even here. Servants sometimes played tricks, dragging chains in hallways, whispering through cracks, watching grown warriors leap from their beds in terror. Imagine the laughter in the kitchens the next day, as squires teased knights for believing in ghosts. But not every shadow was a prank. in castles that echoed with centuries of blood and betrayal. Fear was never far. Some knights tried to fight spirits with faith. They hung relics above their beds, carved holy symbols into their doors, or whispered prayers against the restless dead. Others leaned on superstition, placing iron nails in walls, scattering salt across thresholds, or sleeping with daggers under pillows. Whether holy or pagan, the goal was the same: to guard against what could not be seen. Now imagine yourself in that bed, the chamber dark, the stone walls breathing with silence. You feel the air grow colder, a shape shift in the shadows. Do you whisper a prayer? Do you grip steel, though it will do no good against air? Or do you close your eyes, hoping that if you cannot see the ghost, it cannot see you? That was the nightly gamble of many nights. So when you think of nights, remember not only banners, battles, and songs of glory. Remember the nights when they trembled at whispers. When guilt became phantom, when the past returned in forms no sword could cut. For behind closed doors, nights fought not just enemies of flesh, but ghosts born of memory, sin, and fear. For all the talk of honor and duty, nights were still men, men with hearts that beat, blood that burned, and longings that no code of chivalry could silence. Behind closed doors, when torches dimmed and watchmen dozed, desire crept into chambers like a thief. It came in whispers, in stolen glances, in footsteps too soft for stone floors. Picture a knight pacing his chamber, restless, staring at the door. A knock comes, quiet, cautious. A figure slips inside, cloaked, face half hidden. Perhaps she is a lady of the court, bound by vows to another. Perhaps she is a servant, risking everything for a moment of tenderness. Perhaps she is only memory, imagined into flesh by a man too lonely to resist. Whatever the truth, the chamber transforms. No longer a place of solitude, it becomes a stage for passion forbidden. These encounters were dangerous. Discovery could mean scandal, disgrace, exile, even execution. And yet temptation was stronger than fear. Love in daylight might be impossible, but at night behind stone walls, knights gambled everything for the warmth of another body, for a few hours. They were not soldiers, not servants of lords or kings, but simply men and women bound by desire. Not every tryst was romantic. Some were clumsy, rushed, filled with laughter at awkward moments, the knight fumbling with armor straps, the lady whispering quiet, while trying not to giggle. Desire could be tender, but it could also be absurd, reminding us that even in secret passion, humanity's flaws refuse to hide. There were also darker encounters. Some knights exploited their power, bending servants to their will, turning intimacy into command. Others fell into obsessive love, writing endless letters, whispering vows they could never keep, haunting their chambers with longing that bordered on madness in the privacy of stone rooms. Passion could be salvation or destruction. Whispers of desire were not always physical. Sometimes they were words exchanged in hushed tones, promises spoken in the dark. A knight might swear devotion to someone he could never publicly name, or confess feelings that would ruin him if overheard. These whispers lingered in the chamber long after the speakers left, carried like ghosts in the walls. Imagine yourself in that chamber, the door shut tight, the world outside forgotten. Would you risk everything for a fleeting embrace? Would you whisper love you cannot declare in daylight? Or would you bury desire deep, letting it gnaw at your soul rather than risk exposure? The choice was the same then as it is now. Desire tempts, but it also demands a price. So when you think of knights, remember not only shining armor and noble vows. Remember the whispers in the night, the stolen kisses, the laughter muffled by fear. The promises no priest ever heard. For behind closed doors, knights revealed not only courage and piety, but the most human truth of all, that even legends long to love and be loved. Behind the tales of honor and loyalty, knights often lived in a world of schemes. Their chambers, seemingly private sanctuaries, were sometimes the stage for whispered plans. Alliances forged in secret and betrayals set into motion. Behind closed doors, ambition walked hand in hand with fear, and the clinking of goblets could mask the plotting of treason. Picture a chamber lit dimly by a single candle. Two knights sit close, voices low. One leans forward, whispering of grievances against their lord. Unfair taxes, broken promises, favoritism shown to rivals. The other nods, eyes sharp, already imagining a future where loyalty shifts. They swear each other to silence. Yet both know silence is the most fragile oath of all. Sometimes the schemes were small, plotting to cheat at dice, sneaking extra rations, arranging secret meetings with lovers. But often they grew larger, darker. Knights might conspire to disobey commands, to delay marching to war, or to secretly support one faction while publicly serving another. These were the politics of survival, played not in royal courts but in cramped stone rooms. Servants occasionally overheard such whispers, carrying fragments of dangerous knowledge. A word too loudly spoken, a name uttered at the wrong moment, could doom conspirators, yet risk only added thrill. Some knights found plotting more intoxicating than wine, hearts racing as if schemes themselves were battles to be won. There were layers of irony. The same knight who swore loyalty at dawn might break bread by night with men planning rebellion. The same lips that praised God in mass might curse their lords in shadow. Honor and deception danced together, each step as dangerous as swordplay. Not all schemes were grand treason. Some were simply practical, smuggling forbidden books, hiding stolen spoils, arranging bribes to gain better postings. Imagine two knights arguing over who should guard the fattest trade route, each pretending to serve their lord's interests while truly seeking profit. In such moments, the chamber became less a place of chivalry and more a marketplace of ambition. Yet not all plotting ended well. Some schemes unraveled when one conspirator betrayed another for gold, favor, or survival. History remembers great rebellions, but it forgets the countless smaller betrayals whispered in dark rooms. For every rebellion that succeeded, dozens of plots died in silence, their ashes scattered before ever touching the light. Humor had its place too. Imagine two drunken knights attempting to whisper a plot, only to argue so loudly that servants down the hall heard every word. Or a would-be conspirator falling asleep mid-scheme, leaving his partner muttering alone. Even treason could stumble into farce. Now imagine yourself among them. Would you whisper with the plotters, risking your honor for chance at power? Would you listen quietly, saying nothing, fearing both betrayal and silence, or would you report them, knowing your own name might soon be whispered in another chamber, in a world of shadows? Every choice carried weight. So when you picture knights, do not see only shining armor and solemn vows. See also the chambers where ambition brewed, where whispers spun webs of loyalty and deceit, where schemes rose and fell like battles fought without swords, for behind closed doors knights played not only at war but at politics. And sometimes, the shadows proved deadlier than the battlefield. Every night ended the same way, with the coming of dawn. The chamber doors creaked open, the servants entered, and the world of shadows slipped back into silence. Behind closed doors, knights had revealed their desires, fears, and flaws. But when the morning light spilled across stone floors, everything was covered again beneath the mask of honor. Picture a knight rising from his straw mattress. His head still aches from wine, his heart still heavy with secrets whispered in the dark. He glances at the locked chest at the foot of his bed, where letters, trinkets, and hidden sins sleep. He straightens, pulls on his tunic, and ties his belt. By the time he steps into the corridor, his face is calm, his stride steady. No one must know what the night has shown. The rituals of dawn were simple, but they mattered. Water splashed on faces erased the stains of tears. Fresh tunics covered bruises from drunken brawls. Prayers spoken in the chapel washed away the guilt of confessions half-whispered hours earlier. Daylight became armor as surely as steel, a shield against the fragile truths that lingered in the chamber. To the world the night returned as legend, loyal, fearless, disciplined. Servants bowed, comrades saluted, lords trusted. Yet beneath that polished image lay the chaos of nights past. The dice rolled in secrecy, the kisses stolen, the ghosts feared, the schemes whispered. None of it appeared in chronicles, because chronicles served power, not truth. But the truth lingered. It lingered in the eyes of squires who had carried away their masters drunk, in the smirks of servants who had overheard laughter at midnight, in the silence of knights who remembered words spoken in confidence. The chamber kept its secrets, but it was never truly sealed. There was irony in this double life. Knights fought bravely by day, but their greater struggle was often with themselves at night. They could face armies without trembling. Yet a letter in a chest, a dream in the dark, or a whisper of desire could undo them. The world praised them for courage, but rarely saw the courage it took to carry the weight of unseen battles. Humor softened even this truth. A knight might stumble into chapel still reeking of ale, earning discreet chuckles from priests. Another might doze off during mass, head bobbing like a child's, only to swear later he had been deep in prayer. These little absurdities reminded everyone that knights were men first, legends second. Now imagine yourself at dawn, standing at that chamber door. Do you open it with pride, ready to play the role the world expects, or do you hesitate, wishing the knight's honesty could remain? Would you rather be remembered as a flawless knight, or as a flawed human whose truth might never be sung? For that is the paradox. Behind closed doors, knights revealed who they really were, but history remembers only the mask, and perhaps that is why their stories still haunt us. Because we sense that what was written was never the whole truth. So when you think of medieval knights, remember both worlds. Remember the clash of steel and the roar of crowds, but also remember the locked chests, the whispered jokes, the unsent letters, the ghosts in the corners, for behind every shining figure on horseback was a chamber full of shadows, where men lived not as legends but as fragile souls. And now, as the dawn breaks in our tale, let us close the door one last time. Thank you for walking through these hidden nights with me. Before you leave, take a moment, drop a comment below and tell me, if you could ask one question to a medieval knight, what would it be? And of course, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so we can explore more forgotten corners of history together.